If you've clicked on this video, you know what JoJo's Bizarre Adventure is. In this video, I will go through all 8 parts of JoJo and discuss my thoughts and opinions on each of them. There will be spoilers for parts 1 to 6, however 7 and 8 won't have any spoilers as many haven't read them yet. One important thing to remember is I'm going to sometimes just say something without adding in my opinion to the end of it. Just know that this entire video is my opinion and you're allowed to disagree with it. Alright, this video is long enough, so here we go with part 1. Phantom Blood is, in my opinion, the worst part of JoJo, but I feel like that more so shows how good the other parts are. The best episode of Phantom Blood is the first one. I cannot stress enough how perfect this episode is. In just 25 minutes, we're introduced to Jonathan, Dio, Irina, the basic conflict of the story. We have multiple fight scenes, and we very quickly and easily hate our main villain. Part 1's greatest strength, in my opinion, is Dio. The fact that he grew up with this absolutely awful upbringing and is willing to do anything to get on top is interesting and kind of sympathetic. However, after we see the immense power of the stone mask, he begins to no longer simply want the Joestar's benefits. He wants to rule the world. One interesting thing about Dio is that he had to work harder than Jonathan to get ahead in the world on account of his being poor. He grew up hating Jonathan just because he was rich and lazy. However, once Dio gains his vampiric abilities, he doesn't seem to do anything but serve his own desires. Jonathan, however, has to work extremely hard to perfect his Hamon. Dio contradicts himself. If he believes hard work should be rewarded, then Jonathan deserves to be above Dio. Anyways, the side characters are... All memes and jokes aside, Speedwagon is a fun and helpful guy, but I just wish he had more character development. Zeppeli is interesting. I like his teaching methods, but I think he died a little bit too early. Speaking of when he died, the Bruford and Tarkus fight is pretty weak. Frankly, all the fights in part 1 are weak, except the ones with Dio. I think my biggest problem with part 1 is that the in-between episodes are just not that good. The part is great at its beginning and end. However, all the other fight/training scenes are either too long or not long enough. Part 1 is an establishment part. At least that's how it feels. Since we know that Araki planned JoJo out to the end of part 3, it doesn't seem too far-fetched to say that based on how short part 1 is, this is mostly an establishment part. That isn't necessarily a bad thing because it does what it's supposed to pretty well. And we see some seeds planted that will blossom later. The fight where Jonathan has to get a breath of air to use his Hamon doesn't feel like the normal punchy battle, and it kinda reminds me of the later battles like with Darby or the Beetle fight from part 8. I really like those JoJo fights where they're not just brawling. Instead they have to do some weird mundane thing to win the stand battle. Finally, part 1 actually has a really amazing ending. One of the best endings in the series actually. Jonathan's death, Dio's return, Irina's reaction, the lead into part 2 and 3, it's all great. The final conversation between Jonathan and Dio was also perfect. The way Jonathan held Dio, despite everything. I still think that Jonathan was just too nice for his own good. He believed that Dio had some kind of human emotion in him, but we know from the future that Dio wasn't lying when he said he was going to reject his humanity. Overall, part 1 is flawed, but it isn't terrible, especially in retrospection. When watching JoJo for the first time, turning on part 2 just to see this super stylish intro and this new JoJo who is basically the complete opposite of Jonathan kinda caught me off guard. Seeing Joseph suddenly crack jokes and one-liners during battles, using these weird strategies to battle, and seeing his frankly hilarious fear of his grandmother, it felt like they gave Jonathan a personality. That may sound like I'm dunking on Jonathan, but I'm really not. There's something to be said about having a simple battle between good and evil where your hero is a kind gentleman to everyone around him. However, Joseph is funny. His whole "your next line will be" is one of the things I love about Joseph. It contributes absolutely nothing to his character development or anything like that. It's literally just a taunt to get his opponent flustered. Joseph is my favorite main universe JoJo. He's just so fun and I really like his character design. His whole battle style of being a trickster with something up his sleeve is great. The side characters were also majorly improved. Caesar is a fantastic partner to Joseph. Despite being polar opposites, they both learn things from each other. And similarly to Joseph, I love the absurdity of his bubble techniques. Lisa is also really great. She has really good character development and the reveal of her being Joseph's mom ties really well to the end of part 1. Her teaching style is kind of like that absurdist style, similar to Zeppeli's, and I feel like she meshes really well with Joseph and Caesar. Stroheim, I don't like him too much. He has some funny moments, but I just don't find him to be that interesting. The villains of this part are great. The Pillar Men being so absolutely powerful is just amazing. The raw strength that they have compared to our main characters leads to some really interesting interactions. I'm glad Araki actually committed to their immense strength and didn't just make them suddenly weak for some reason. All the Pillar Men fights are great. Santana's fight is really good, but the reveal that the other Pillar Men are even stronger than him is also just amazing. The AC/DC fight is one of the best Joseph fights with all the tricks he pulls out. And And that fight where they're racing to grab the red stone is another one of those types of fights where they aren't directly punching that I love. The Wamu fight is, in my opinion, the peak of this part. And you all know where I'm going, but Caesar's death is one of the best in the whole series. The fact that the last conversation he had with Joseph was one where they disrespected and attacked each other is immensely depressing. That final fight with Wamu was great. He gets so close but loses because he went about it alone. But despite what he said about Joseph, the final thing he does to Wamu after he knows he's lost is take off that lip ring that will save Joseph. That scene with Lisa and Joseph walking to that room, the lines, "your cigarette is backwards," and "I was worried that when I called out Caesar's name I would hear no answer," are amazing. And as much as people joke about it, that scream from Joseph ties it all together. Ever since I saw this quote be associated with Joseph and Caesar, I haven't been the same since. The horse race between Joseph and Wamu is done really well, and the final trick Joseph plays is great. But that final Cars fight is just phenomenal. The reveal of Ultimate Cars is great. Him standing in front of the rising sun is an amazing shot, and the fact that we were constantly teased about this ultimate form but we finally got to see it is amazing. We've already seen how strong Cars is, but now he is literally immortal. When Joseph gets Cars into the volcano and thinks he's won, just for Cars to come out unscathed is amazing. It really had me thinking that it might be over for Joseph, but the volcano eruption pushing Cars into space, and the fact that Cars lost because he got flustered by Joseph's line prediction is just perfect. Finally, Cars' fate of being trapped forever in space is kinda scary to think about. Part 2's ending leading right into Part 3 is also really cool. The music and intro of Part 2 are also really good. I think Bloody Stream is possibly my favorite intro of all time. I have to say that I believe Part 2 is the most consistent part. There isn't really any arc or fight that lasts for too long or too short. I think the only problem with Part 2 is that it itself is a bit too short. When my only complaint is that the story was short, that's how you know I like a part. Part 3 is the JoJo part. Jotaro is basically the mascot of JoJo. Dio's "the world" is so iconic. Old Joseph saying "oh my god." The stands, walk like an Egyptian. If there's one part someone who isn't into JoJo knows the most about, it's probably 3. I'm personally a little more conflicted on this part though. I think the manga is really good. The beginning art style is a bit rough, but as Araki finds his footing, it becomes a lot better. This same notion can be applied to the stand battles. It makes sense considering that he introduced a whole new power system, but in my opinion, the fights before Egypt are significantly worse than the fights after. Compare fights like Darby the Gambler, and Duel, Vanilla Ice, and Pet Shop to some of the earlier ones like Wheel of Fortune, Dark Blue Moon, and Empress. They just don't hold up in my opinion. Also, I really didn't like Jotaro at the beginning of the part. I get that that's the point, but it seems completely unrealistic how mean he is to his mom. I'm not 100% sure about this, but I thought I saw an Araki interview where he admitted to making Jotaro too mean at the beginning of the part, and it made him far too unlikable. I think we can start talking about the other Crusaders here, and this is where my opinions might become more mixed. Kakyoin is up first, and I'm sorry, but he is almost entirely defined by his death. I'm not gonna sit here and pretend like it wasn't a sad death, or that he has no character, but I just didn't feel it from him. He didn't live up to Caesar in my opinion, and frankly his stand and personality are not unique enough to keep me interested. Avdol is up next, and I really want to like this character because I think he has a cool stand and is just overall a fun and nice guy, but he really suffers from being gone from like a third of the story for no reason. We also got no backstory to him, no intense character motivation, and similar to Kakyoin, I feel like his best moment is by far his death. Iggy has a similar issue. Due to being introduced halfway through the part, I feel like he doesn't have that same synergy with the Crusaders, and I didn't really feel like I had a reason to be rooting for him other than he's a funny dog. One issue I also have with Iggy is that he's absent from almost all the fights, which is fine if you want him to be a comic relief character, but if you want a comic relief character, don't give me this weird half-baked backstory and frankly the saddest death in the part, like Jesus. There isn't really much to say about Joseph because he doesn't change much throughout the story, which is okay because we saw him very frequently in the last part. One thing I do miss is his trickster fighting style. We kind of saw it in the Empress fight, but besides that, he almost always uses his stand completely normally. Finally, we have Polnareff. In my opinion, Polnareff is the most developed Crusader, with a clear and sad backstory, motivation, and a nice, albeit sad, send-off. Alright, enough with this character depth stuff, let's talk about the funny punching ghosts. Stands are new to this part, and while I kinda criticized it earlier, it's clear that Araki knew the potential of this power system from the beginning. However, since during the writing of this part he believed it to be the last, some of the earlier stands are just really simple. Magician's Red is just fire control, Silver Cherry is a guy with a sword, Dark Blue Moon is basically just a fish, and the list goes on. This isn't necessarily a bad thing, frankly the newer stands are too complicated, but I feel like it can sometimes make the fights feel really similar similar with such limited abilities. But speaking of limited abilities, Araki had a really bad habit of using an ability once and then never again. Now I'm not someone who claims that Araki forgot these abilities, I'm just saying the writing is kinda weird. Like, why can Silver Chariot take off his armor but he never does? Why was Starfinger never used again? I feel like there should have just been one more scene with Dio using Jonathan's stand, or at least some clarification on what that scene even was. I don't know, maybe that's just me. I'm really ragging on part 3, but I truly don't hate it. The manga, that is. The anime has such bad pacing, I'm sorry. Guess which part's manga is longer, 3 or 4? Now, guess which one has more episodes? Like, how did you need 9 more episodes for a shorter story? I'll tell you why, because these fights drag on. Why did Alessi and Mariah both get 2 episodes each? The adaptations of these fights take so long that it made watching part 3 for the first time kind of boring. I actually almost dropped JoJo for the first time when watching part 3. Alright, villain time. Dio is once again the villain of this part, and from the beginning of the story, he and his stand are really hyped up. And frankly, I think he lived up to the hype. You're honestly kind of watching this part just for that final fight, and like Dio, I believed it lived up to the hype. Dio's ability is a really cool and interesting one. The fight between him and Jotaro doesn't feel too long or too short. There are so many great moments, like when he stops his own heart, when Jotaro tricks Dio with the magnet, and that scene with the knives. It's all great. One minor issue I have though is Dio's design. He's meant to be an extremely attractive and charismatic guy, but looking at him, he's not exactly good looking. Like, look at Dio in the manga compared to in the anime. He looks so much better here. In my opinion, he looks even better in part 1. This is what I mean by the part 3 style looks kinda basic. Jotaro's final blow on Dio is immensely satisfying, and that final scene of Jotaro looking at the photo, perfect ending. Frankly, JoJo could have ended right here, but I'm very glad it didn't, because we ended up getting Part 4 took a completely different direction from Part 3. It wasn't that kind of serious, grand adventure that takes place all around the world. It was a small murder mystery story that all took place in one crazy, noisy, bizarre town. Since Araki was planning on ending JoJo with Part 3, I believe he didn't really have a plan to get another JoJo, and so the Joseph cheating storyline did feel a little bit out of character, but I'll forgive it because it gives us a great JoJo. Josuke Higashikata is our new main character, and he's a great one. He's similar to Joseph with his little quirks and his intolerance to hair insults. Josuke is actually a really cool new character, and Crazy Diamond is a great stand. The ability to heal other objects and people, but not himself, is a great manifestation of Josuke's tough yet caring soul. The town of Morio is a great setting, with the weird yellow sky, the bizarre citizens, and all the stand users. It's interesting how Araki showed how stands are used in normal life with characters like Rohan and Aya. Now Part 4 does an interesting thing, where because it's in a small town, they introduce a lot of characters, and those characters continue to come back throughout the part, even minor ones. Small antagonists like Yukiko, Hazamada, and Kobayashi come back a couple times. Other characters like Rohan and Reimi become more main characters. Our general cast is, in my opinion, stronger than Part 3. This general cast consists of Josuke, Okuyasu, Koichi, and Jotaro. You could also consider Rohan to be included too. All of these characters are really great in their own ways. Josuke has a fun personality and is just a great and caring main character. It's fun to see Jotaro again, and he works as a person to tell our main cast what they're meant to be doing, especially at the beginning. He's kinda a better version of old Joseph. Okuyasu is more of just a silly guy, but I do like his development with his brother and how everyone sees him as dumb. To be honest, I feel like he could have used a little bit more development or had some more cool scenes, but I still really like him. His stand is also really great. The fact that it's among the strongest in the series but is held back by Okuyasu's incompetence is fun. And as many really funny memes I see about him being a reliable guy, I do genuinely really like Koichi. In my opinion, he really shines in the sheer heart attack fight and in the Yukiko fights. Our villain for this part is Yoshikage Kira, and once he's introduced, he is one of the best villains in the series, and frankly, one of my favorite characters in the entire series. But like I said, once he's introduced. In the manga, Kira is not properly introduced until around halfway through with the Yoshikage Kira just wants to live a quiet life chapter. In the anime, there are some teasers with him in the hands and seeing Kira just walking around Morio, but before Kira we had Akira Otoishi as our main villain, who is much weaker than him. He's the one with Red Hot Chili Pepper, which just isn't that cool of a stand. To be honest, before Kira, Part 4 feels a little directionless. That's not to say all the fights are bad, or that the part isn't good. It just doesn't feel like all the previous parts where our main characters have something they're constantly working towards. I think a great example of this is the Hazamada fight. Hazamada wants to kill Jotaro, but we're never even actually given a reason for why he wants to do so. I think it would be better if Hazamada was hired by Kira or something. Once Kira is introduced, however, the part gets really good. The introduction to Kira is iconic and proves that he is deserving of being our villain. While we do see his weird obsession with hands and we get confirmation that he's murdered people beforehand, seeing what he does in this episode really makes you hate him. The speech he gives to Shigechi is something that really cements his insanity, and frankly, it's bizarre how similar it is to Patrick Bateman's speech at the beginning of American Psycho, to the point where I think it might have been an inspiration. While I've seen some say they didn't care about Shigechi's death, it is, in my opinion, one of the saddest in the series. The fact that Kira went after this innocent child, literally blowing him up, proves how pathetic and evil he is. From this point on in the story, part 4 is amazing. Kira disguising himself as Kozaku Kawajiri, the July 15th arc, and finally, one of the best arcs of JoJo, Bites the Dust. I'm not gonna lie, I still really don't know how Kira got Bites the Dust. I don't think it's Requiem, but maybe it's something similar to that. Anyways, the reason this arc is so amazing is that Killer Queen is not that physically strong of a stand. It would lose to most of the other stands of the main cast. So how do you make Kira extremely intimidating? Make his opponent 11. Hayato Kawajiri is our main protagonist for most of the Bites the Dust arc. The death loop of Bites the Dust is a terrifyingly strong ability, especially when using someone like Hayato who doesn't have a stand or the physical strength to fight back. Despite this, Hayato outsmarts Kira and calls Josuke and Okuyasu. From here the fight truly begins, and it's great. Finally, once Jotaro comes in, you already know it's over. One final great Koichi moment and the fight ends with Kira dying, in, honestly, a pretty gruesome way. Overall, part 4 has a bit of a rocky start, but its second half really cements it as what I consider to be possibly the best part so far. Part 5 is generally one of the most disliked parts by the Western fanbase, despite actually being the most liked part in Japan. I believe this is because of two things. One, the lack of a recurring character, and two, the poor English translations of the manga before it was officially translated. What I mean by the first one is it seems like a lot of people really want Golden Wind to be more connected to the rest of the JoJo story. I mean, in theory you could completely skip Golden Wind and still fully understand Stone Ocean. But by skipping Golden Wind, you miss out on what I believe to be one of the best full stories told in JoJo. Remember what I said about part 2 having no bad arcs? This also applies to Golden Wind, excluding maybe one I'll talk about later. Before that though, let me explain what I meant by poor English translation. Before the Golden Wind manga was in English and before the anime was out, there were a lot of online translations for this part, and these translations frankly weren't the best. Part 5 has some complicated aspects to it, and they really weren't well explained in these translations. The biggest offender of this is King Crimson, whose ability was consistently described incorrectly. Other concepts such as Requiem and the arrows were also explained extremely poorly. But now that we have official translations in the anime, we can evaluate Golden Wind as what it actually is, not what the English translators thought it was. First off, Golden Wind takes place entirely in Italy, and it's not just a setting, it's basically the crux of the entire story. The amount of real Italian locations shown, the mafia, the culture, and more, it screams Italy, and Araki did a really good job of introducing the country to people who aren't familiar. I'm not Italian, but from what I've seen online, Golden Wind does a really great job showing off the culture. I think one of the biggest criticisms I've seen about Golden Wind is Giorno himself. Many say that he's the most boring JoJo, or that he goes through no development throughout the story, and many others say that him being the son of Dio never comes into the picture. These are both misinterpretations. I'm going to kind of streamline my thoughts as I might make an entire video just about Golden Wind, but first, saying he doesn't go through any development is technically true. Giorno begins the part with a goal, and he ends it with accomplishing that goal. However, it seems that throughout his opinions don't really change. In fact, I think seeing the cruelty of Diavolo and the stories of the gang members may have made him hate the Mafia even more. He already knows what he wants, and he spends the whole part trying to accomplish it. Whether you find that interesting or not is up to personal opinion, but I don't really think it's poor writing. Second, we do actually see a bit of Dio in Giorno. Giorno is possibly the cruelest JoJo, certainly from the main universe. We see him kill people without a second thought. He subjects Diavolo to the death loop, somewhat manipulates the gang to get on top, and does not give mercy to people he doesn't like. The difference between him and Dio is that Giorno uses that resolve for good. Okay, enough about Giorno. The rest of the gang are also amazing. Despite there being a lot of them, they all feel really well developed. They're all given good backstories, except Fugo, who got one added in the anime. They are all given motivations and dynamics that are all explained really well. I honestly feel like they're a better group than the Crusaders. Also, the stands in this part are my favorite in the whole series. Part 5 definitely shines with stands like Sex Pistols, Moody Blues, White Album, King Crimson, Metallica, Notorious B.I.G., and way more. The villains are also amazing. This part does not suffer from what Stardust Crusaders did. All the villains, even minor beginner ones are memorable to me. This is for a couple reasons. 1, they have more interesting abilities, 2, they have more interesting personalities, and 3, their fights usually lead to more interesting combat. Ghiaccio, Risotto, Malone, and Prosciutto/Pesci all had amazing fights. The art style of Part 5 is also where I believe the new age of JoJo art actually began. We see it start to form midway through Part 4, I mean just look at Josuke at the beginning of the part compared to at the end, but Part 5 began and ended without as much of a drastic change in art style, and I think it was clear that Araki was getting more comfortable. The outfits in this part are also really starting to get good. This is where Araki began to give his characters more out there clothes. Not that he didn't do that already, but we saw it a lot more here. The anime art style is also a great interpretation, and I think has the best animation so far. I've already explained the general story with Giorno trying to become the boss, but the story midway through has a great scene I want to talk about. When taking the boss's daughter, Trish, to see him for the first time, we see that his true goal from the beginning was to kill her. Bruno obviously didn't let that happen, and he only lived because of Giorno, and even then he was on a timer. From here, Bruno and Giorno's goal to overthrow the boss now became the goal of the entire group, except Fugo, as to not go against the boss. And he's never seen again. This was, and still is, heavily scrutinized, but I personally believe that with Purple Haze feedback, we don't need any more with Fugo. Now, the character deaths. First off, Abakio, who I believe to have the saddest death on this part, and possibly the saddest death of the entire series. The extremely sudden nature of it, his reaction when he realizes what's going on, and finally, Narancia's reaction. This reaction and the line, "Are we just going to leave him here all alone?" is one of the saddest moments in this part. Narancia's death is also really sad, but in my opinion they should have mourned a little bit longer. Maybe they could have shown Narancia in a similar dream world as they did for Abakio. Maybe even just a flashback with him and Fugo. But this line will forever be sad. Finally, Bruno, who really didn't have that sad of a death, but it didn't have to be. We had a lot of time to prepare and we knew that he was going to die eventually, so the impact and shock are a little bit removed. Still really great though. Okay, now we will talk about what I consider to be Golden Wind's fumble. The Requiem quietly plays. I'll go quickly because this section is already super long. Polnareff's return is really cool, and I really like Diavolo's backstory. Diavolo's ability use is cool, and seeing Polnareff pierce Chariot is also really great. I think this part is a bit confusing and could have used a bit more explanation, but I understand the whole point was that both us as the viewer and the gang are confused, but still, the whole Chariot Requiem fight is frankly dumb and contrived. The body swap jokes and confusion go on for far too long, but once Chariot Requiem is defeated and the arrow goes back to its true owner, we get back to peak. Gold Experience Requiem is amazing, and Diavolo's death loop doesn't necessarily feel undeserved. Diavolo is a very bad person who would kill children, sell drugs to millions, and more. As a villain, Diavolo's obsession with changing fate is interesting, but he still ends up being a bit weak. Finally, Sleeping Slaves is a really fantastic ending arc that wraps up Part 5 well. Overall, I love Golden Wind and think it is massively, massively underrated. When I said Part 5 is one of the most disliked parts, I meant it. But I think Part 6 is undeniably the most disliked part, other than maybe Part 1. This is for a variety of reasons, and some are far more valid than others. I will start off by saying that the claim that Araki wrote this part to be politically correct or whatever is ridiculous. Having a female main character and generally female cast does not mean that. And if you dislike the part for that, you're just being dumb. I will say that Stone Ocean is the best and worst of JoJo. Some of the fights are the best in the series so far, and some of them are the worst. I think one problem with Stone Ocean is that its peak is its beginning and end. It takes a similar approach to Stardust Crusaders, where they hype up the Heaven plan from very early on, and we don't actually see it until the very end. This leads to the middle of Stone Ocean kind of dragging, especially with some subpar fights. But before that, we can look at the characters. Jolyne is the only JoJo who is competing for Joseph for being my favorite main universe protagonist. She begins the part apathetic and angry at everyone around her. She seemingly has the mindset that the world has put her where she is, and there's nothing she can do. Being sent to prison, however, begins to rough up that mindset. We see this in the Goo Goo Dolls fight. After Jotaro returns, however, we see that resolve begin to creep out. Once Jotaro's discs are removed and he's practically dead, we see her not run away, but instead decide to stay in the prison so that she can find who stole the discs and do something about it. Also, Jotaro's death scene is done really well. From here, we begin to properly meet our side characters, like Ermes, who has a really bad first fight. Besides that, however, Ermes is one of the best side characters in the series. While she's gone for the maximum security arc, her loyalty to Jolyne is undeniable. The Sports Max fight is the peak of this loyalty towards her sister. We see Ermes' amazing resolve to avenge her sister, and the fight is just amazing. Foo Fighters I'm a little more conflicted about. I think she's a really funny and entertaining character, but I had trouble taking her death seriously. I just feel like it wasn't that sad. That may be just me, however. I do really like her stand, design, and the few fights she was in. When first reading Stone Ocean, I thought Weather and Anasui were both underdeveloped, but upon rereading the manga and watching the anime, I can say that they are both amazing characters. I do wish we saw a little bit more of Weather's stand, but that's really all. Finally, Emporia, who I thought the entire part was a completely useless character, until the end, but that's for later. Stone Ocean rapidly changes in quality. Viviana Westwood is one of the best fights in the series, and then Dragon's Dream is one of the worst. And they're literally right in sequence from each other. I just feel like some of these stand battles are poorly thought out. Like the solution for the Yo-Yo Ma fight. Why did Anasui not just do that earlier if he could've? Even if that question has a solution I'm missing, the fight is just kind of boring in my opinion. However, I will say that Jailhouse Lock onwards is almost perfect. All the fights beginning at that point have a story meaning, or they're just really well fought. Even a bit before Jailhouse Lock, that handcuff fight between Jolyne and Pucci is excellently fought on both sides, and extremely fun to watch. The only low point is Bohemian Rhapsody, but even that one isn't awful. Sky High, Underworld, Heavy Weather, Sea Moon, and Made in Heaven. They're all near perfect. The only issue I have with these fights is I think Heavy Weather's explanation is kinda dumb, but the backstory for Pucci and Weather makes up for it. Underworld is a great Jolyne and Ermes fight. Finally, Sea Moon and Made in Heaven provide what I will call the best ending to any JoJo part. The Sea Moon fight is the perfect 1v1. It shows just how strong Jolyne is, where despite having what I would call the weakest stand out of any of the JoJos, she can still fight Sea Moon, which I don't think they all could have done. It shows Jolyne's battle intelligence along with how determined she is to defeat Pucci. I love when she just starts touching his face, toying with him. I'm also glad Anasui was somewhat involved in this fight. One problem I sometimes have with JoJo 1v1s is that it sometimes doesn't make any sense why the other members of the group aren't helping, but here we see Anasui helping Jolyne throughout, even if it doesn't actually do much. From here, Jotaro shows up again in his classic dramatic method, just like in part 4. However, we see Pucci actually achieve heaven, and from here, we see by far the most desperate and careful final fight in JoJo. Made in Heaven is undeniably the strongest stand in the base universe. And seeing that strength going up against the Stone Ocean cast is kinda scary. The way Pucci is drawn in this part, his eyes already being invisible, his stance, his speech, it's all that of someone who knows he's already won. There isn't any fear in him, he knows that it's all already over. Even part 3 Dio didn't give this amount of fear. We even see it in Jotaro. He doesn't 1v1 Pucci, he just makes sure everyone doesn't get picked off. Now, that final moment where Pucci kills Anasui and Jotaro stops time, I consider this to be possibly the best scene in the original universe. Jotaro's extreme stress, the lack of time, the confusion, and that final moment where Jotaro literally picks Jolyne over the universe. It shows the growth we see him go through and demonstrates how he did always love Jolyne. The two-step speech by Pucci is what cemented him as the best villain in the series for me, and Jolyne's death, sacrificing herself for Emporio, is beautiful. Emporio in the new universe running away from Pucci feels reminiscent of Kira vs. Hayato. The weather report disc being inserted is a great panel, and Pucci's death and the universe reset led to an amazing ending. The entirety of Stone Ocean didn't happen in this new universe. Pucci never existed, and due to that, all the characters have happier lives. It's the perfect amount of happiness and sadness. Also, that ending with Distant Dreamer fading into Roundabout was phenomenal. I touched on it earlier, but I consider Pucci to be the best villain in the series. When he led to the death of his own sister, he was in a vulnerable position where he sought out Dio. He was then manipulated into dedicating his life to what he believed would have helped him. If Pucci knew Perla would die, he could have accepted it quicker. Dio found the perfect confidant in Pucci, and his misuse of religion in the part is so interesting to watch. Overall, I love Stone Ocean, but it is far from perfect with its ups and downs. Part 7 is my favorite part. I won't go into too much detail about it in Part 8 because I expect many watching this haven't read the manga, but I hope my analysis and praise will convince you to. Steel Ball Run is a reset of the JoJo universe. It is completely disconnected from the previous parts, other than some shared names and stands. Even then, Steel Ball Run takes great focus on another type of power rather than Hamon. Spin. I really like how Spin was handled. It feels like a great extension of Hamon, and I love his connection to stands. In terms of characters, our main two are Johnny and Gyro. This is the part where Araki did something interesting, in which he made both the main JoJo and the JoBro equally important. He gave both of them phenomenally told backstories, interesting abilities, and different character motivations that both feel fully realized. And best of all, he made them feel like they have a very natural bond. I would say Gyro and Johnny have the best relationship in JoJo. This is a good time to say that Gyro is my all-time favorite JoJo character for all the reasons I said earlier. Johnny is also pretty amazing, but I feel like Gyro is just a bit more fun to follow. The other side characters are also really well written. We got some old friends, some new friends, and yes, even a bear. In all honesty, the characters fill a role. Sandman, Hot Pants, Diego, Lucy, Steven, and Poco Loco all feel important and needed. Steel Ball Run contains some of the best fights that aren't the final battle in JoJo. I think for most parts it's generally agreed that the final battle is the best one, but Steel Ball Run still has some amazing ones even before that final showdown. True Man's World, Sugar Mountain, Wrecking Ball, and Civil War. All these fights are not only very well drawn and acted out, but they all add something to our characters. They leave the fights different people, which kind of gets rid of a common criticism for early JoJo where most of the fights mean nothing. Don't get me wrong, I hate some of the earlier fights like Pork Pie Kid, and even Tomb of the Boom was kind of boring. But Steel Ball Run is very consistently strong with its fights. Steel Ball Run's story direction has that same complication and confusion that is so common for JoJo, where if you try to explain it to someone, you look insane. One thing I appreciate, however, is that I understood almost all of Part 7 on a first read, with the exceptions of the beginning of D4C and how stands are gained. The villain of Part 7 is who many call the best villain in all of JoJo. I'll say who it is because it isn't a spoiler, but President Valentine is a very well-developed character who has an understandable backstory and, in theory, noble intentions. While I personally see him as evil, many people actually consider him to be more of a hero, but I think that's more up to the reader. Ball Breaker followed by Break My Heart, Break Your Heart is a very close second to Part 6's best ending. It's almost all perfect and the art here is absolutely beautiful. These are some of the best panels in JoJo. Steel Ball Run also has so many great quotes. Let's go home. A toast to what? We've lost everything. My heart and actions are utterly unclouded, and more. Part 7 is just so amazing, and between Johnny's acts, Gyro's lessons, and their general speech patterns, it's clear that both these characters showed so much growth throughout the story. Steel Ball Run's ending is also perfect. The actual final panels are beautifully drawn, and the send-off to these characters, it's all perfect. Except High Voltage. This felt like a really weird fanfiction, frankly. It was weird and didn't need to happen. I think the part would have been better without it. Overall, Steel Ball Run isn't perfect, but it's really close. JoJolion is by far the longest JoJo part. One thing I can say about it is that it follows its arcs really hard. You can go from one arc to another and there will usually be a clean transition. These arcs all have a fight within them and usually a small story beat at the beginning or end. The only exception to this are the beginning of the part and Wonder Review, which is such a long fight it basically isn't a fight half the time. JoJolion is similar to Stone Ocean where it differs in quality throughout, but in my opinion it doesn't reach the same heights of Stone Ocean. At the same time, JoJolion is far more consistently good than Stone Ocean. This is especially applicable to the general characters and story beats throughout. JoJolion's fights will suddenly go from amazing and well thought out to borderline unreadable. One big thing in this part is the complication of stands, and it sometimes works, but it sometimes doesn't. Born This Way is a really good fight, and I think it benefits from its complicated stand, but the Aphex twins have a really boring and hard to follow fight. Soft and Wet is my personal favorite stand in terms of design and abilities. It feels like later on Josuke doesn't really use his plundering ability as much, but this isn't necessarily a bad thing, it's just something I noticed. I think another issue with JoJolion is that it feels so long, but it doesn't use its time correctly. Besides Josuke, who we'll talk about later, many other characters feel like they should be more developed, like Yasuho, Toru, Carrera, Hato, Kei, and most of the villains in the second half. Now, that isn't to say that I don't like these characters, but Yasuho is literally present for the entire part, and yet she still somehow feels underdeveloped. I understand that her stand makes it kind of hard for her to directly battle, but I don't know, I just feel like there could have been more. On the complete opposite note, Josuke is my favorite JoJo, like, of all of them. The fact that he doesn't know who he is allows us to explore the world with him. We can see Morio, the Higashikata family, the rock humans, and things like the Lokakaka from an outsider's perspective, because Josuke himself is an outsider. While both Josuke and the reader are in on the mystery of JoJolion, I would say that the mystery of who Josuke is and how he is associated with everyone else in the story is so interesting. While Josuke's character development stagnates a bit after Vitamin C and Killer Queen, it picks back up with the introduction of Rai, who provides a really good outsider's perspective to the Lokakaka and rock humans. One thing I will say is that I prefer Part 8 Morio to Part 4. I like the way that they introduce all these town landmarks like the Johnny statue, Shakedown Road, the pier, the Higashikata parlor, their whole estate, and it creates a fully realized small town. Now, one of the issues with JoJolion to me is the weak character deaths and weak villain. I'm not going to spoil either, but I will say that all the character deaths felt either underwhelming or like they could have been saved for a better moment. The villain is the weakest in all of JoJo. The person is boring and the motives they have frankly don't make sense or are extremely surface level. Wonder Review is a good stand and is really a better villain than its user. Seeing the incredible strength of the stand followed by the creative ways to try to mitigate it was super interesting. The actual ending of JoJolion is frankly a little bit bit contrived, and I would have preferred for Go Beyond to be handled differently. Finally, the actual last panel left me underwhelmed. Radio Gaga was a good story, and Fumi and Lucy is a fun callback, but I would have preferred to maybe see it earlier in the story, like just before Wonder Review. I also need to comment on the art. This is my personal favorite part in terms of art. Araki has mastered this style of semi-realism. His cross-hatching and detail are on another level with JoJolion. Every panel looks like a masterpiece, and JoJolion contains some of the best panels of the whole series. I also just wanted to jump in here while editing. It seems like I was really harsh on JoJolion, but it's actually in my top 3 parts. I really do love a ton about it. The art, the beginning of it, the mystery, Josuke, all the other characters really. So much about it is so fresh, and I really like the direction Araki took JoJo after part 7. I might make an entire video on JoJolion, as despite it not being my favorite part, I feel like there's just a lot to talk about. For now though, JoJolion is a flawed yet underrated part of JoJo that I think should be read by many more than those who have currently read it. Alright, here I am, recording my thoughts on the JoJoLands for the 4th time. Just for clarification, this section will contain spoilers for the first chapter of the JoJoLands. At this point, the first chapter of the manga is out and I am incredibly excited for the JoJoLands. Many of the new characters, new environments, and of course, the new art look amazing. Our new main character is Jodio Joestar, along with his sibling Dragona Joestar. These two look like really fun new characters, and I believe that they'll be able to provide a really fun new narrative for the JoJoLands. From what we see in the first chapter, it appears that Jodio will make all of his money from stealing the diamond. However, based on the ending of the chapter, I think it'll be interesting to see where that goes. Jodio's stand looks interesting, although I'm wondering how it will be used in combat. Every main JoJo, other than Johnny, had a stand from the beginning that was in a humanoid form. Another question I have is how will this relate to the rest of the series? As we see at the end, there's a Japanese man mentioned. My predictions are either Tsurugi or Josuke, but it's probably Josuke because that connects better to part 8. Finally, I wonder who Jodio is meant to be an alternate for. Based on the name, you may think Giorno, but he acts very differently to Giorno, and they really aren't similar at all. If anything, Jolyne makes more sense, but even she doesn't really fit into the character. Dragona's stand looks really fun, but once again, I'm interested to see how it will be used for combat. The JoJoLands looks really promising so far, and I adore the new setting and direction Araki took his art style. Jodio also has a really amazing design, despite what I'm seeing online. I'm personally super excited for the future of part 9, and I might make a mini-series on my channel dissecting each chapter every month. I also really like the way that this part began without as much confusion as JoJolion. While I love JoJolion, its beginning led to a very different part of JoJo than the rest of them, and I'm glad to see that we're back to the bizarre characters and fun themes. Overall, the JoJoLands is looking so promising so far, and I'm excited to see where Araki takes my favorite series.